Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of The Forum. This is the official podcast of the DLP Forum, the Diplomacy, Law and Policy Forum. I'm delighted to have with us today Mr. Dilawar Khan. Our topic for today is refugees and armed conflict. Mr. Dilawar Khan is an expert on refugees. He's also an expert on armed conflict, so he brings all of these together. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. So this issue of refugees, it's really come to the fore, especially after the Syrian crisis, and there's been so much debate around it. There's been so much discussion, more political than legal, but of course the legal dimensions are critical, and of course they inform the political dimensions. And what we see with armed conflict wars is that there is such massive displacement, both internally within the state as well as across borders, refugees, and things like that. What I wanted to ask you is, how do we distinguish between these two main categories? One is internally IDPs, internally displaced persons, and then you have refugees who really, our common understanding is these are people who have left because of armed conflict or something like that, and especially because outside of borders. So how do you distinguish these, and what is the legal regime really that applies in this context to these different categories?
Okay. So recently, with all the armed conflicts and the natural disasters, so the IDP is a term which is not specifically only used during the armed conflict situation. Armed conflict situation is one of the situations. IDPs can be because of floods, because of earthquakes, because of other internal disturbances. So armed conflict is not the
sole reason
criteria that
I see.
IDPs will only happen. And same goes for the refugees. There could be other, but based on the international refugee legal regime. So refugee, the definition is that any person who has a fear of persecution based on race, nationality, political opinion. So there are these 5 conditions. If because of those reasons, if they cross the border, so crossing the border is the threshold for defining you become a refugee if you leave your country.
I see.
So unless and until you have not left your country of origin, as the law says, you cannot be termed as a refugee. So that's one of the fundamental differences that the internally displaced, as the name suggests. So you are displaced, but you are within the country. So maybe you are not in your home, but you are in your country, in your home country. Whereas the refugee situation is that you have moved out and you have crossed the international border. So that's the kind of the international lining for defining the refugee, that you have crossed the international border. Now, of course, these two situations both comes with their own challenges. The IDPs, of course, if they are within the country, so they fall under the domestic legislation or the authorities of the same state. So they are not majorly exposed to international support.
I see.
Because they are in their own country. But if the country is in a war situation, so now we will go into a little more detail, that if you are in a war situation or it's a conflict situation, so then the international humanitarian law would apply on the IDPs as well.
I see. So even in a non-international armed conflict,
yes,
within the borders?
Within the borders.
Okay.
So the IHL would apply, along with human rights law.
Of course.
The fundamentals, the common areas which are between IHL and the human rights law and the domestic legislation.
I see.
Because there are few fundamental human rights that cannot be derogated at any time and point.
That's very interesting. Seeing so many different layers of legal regimes applying to this and trying to negotiate all of that.
Exactly. It's a very the challenges are the same.
Okay.
Because if you go out of your home and you're no more in your hometown, or you have left your homes, so the challenges are similar. You will be looking for shelter. You will be looking for a peaceful place where you don't have a fear of being killed, or all those fears that as a family or as an individual, if you move out of your home. So the legal regime applicable on IDPs would be if a war situation or conflict situation, so IHL, along with international human rights law and the domestic legal regime. And if it's a non-armed conflict situation, so then the basic human rights and the domestic legal legislation would apply.
So in say a flooding situation, natural
flooding
calamity,
situation.
something like that.
So the state needs to provide protection. So because the international regime, which the soul of the international regime revolves around protection.
Absolutely.
That how the law can come to the assistance of those affectees in order to give them protection. And protection from what? Protection from that their lives are safe. Their dignity is preserved. They get food. So dignity is also part of protection.
Yeah.
So that, you should be living in conditions which are humane, which are according to the basic human rights standards. So a conflict situation, a non-conflict situation, different legal regime applies. Now, if we come to the refugees, so the refugees, once they have crossed the border, then the protection regime, which is guaranteed by International Convention on the Rights of the Refugees, 1951, with additional protocol. So that is the legal instrument which directly provides protection to the refugees.
I see.
And many international organizations, but primarily UNHCR is the global mandated organization who looks after the protection of the refugees. And the same protection regime applies, that they should not be exposed to any hostile situation. They should be given, the borders must not be closed if there is a neighboring country and there is a conflict. So the law also demands that you cannot block them. So you allow them.
So people who you can't stop them from escaping.
You cannot, because that's the demand which this is the principle, that in order that they want to leave, you can then, because then states have their own mechanisms to deal with the refugees. So there are two kind of situations where if the state receives the refugees, either the mass exodus, so a lot of people comes in, so the status determination becomes an issue, because you cannot determine their status one by one, because the situation is so big, massive, that a lot of people come. So in that situation, then the host states, they allow them in big numbers.
I see.
So the ideal situation of the refugee status determination, RSD, which the UNHCR would term it, that cannot happen, because there is a conflict on the other side and there are massive numbers coming into the country. So you just allow them.
And the urgency of the situation.
In the urgency of the situation.
Absolutely.
But if the situation is such that there are few families coming in, then you do the refugee status determination. You establish the status.
I see.
So it is not that you can just cross the border and you can claim the refugee status. The refugee status has to meet certain criteria.
And Dilawar, just for clarification, is an asylum seeker a refugee? What is the
asylum is you can call that under the UDHR. Asylum is termed as a basic human right.
Okay.
So it means that anybody can claim asylum, but granting of asylum is the prerogative of the state.
I see.
So it's not that every asylum case would be accepted by the country to which you are requesting. So there is this very legal thing to understand that everyone, myself, yourself, we can claim asylum
petition
anywhere.
For it, apply for it,
because that application is the basic
right.
human right. But then granting or acceptance of that application is the right of the state, because then they have to see conditions, that under what conditions. And again, the threshold, the fundamental point to establish is that is there a fear of being persecution? Is there a fear to your life? Because again, if you look at the soul of the international protection regime lies in protection. Protection from that you should not be exposed to situations which might endanger your life.
Mm-hmm.
So keeping that in mind, so the evaluators from the state side, when they are determining the status of whether an asylum or a refugee, so they look into those very detailed points, that what made you move, because you can be an economic migrant where you had no fear of persecution back in your country,
Absolutely.
or a certain affiliation to a political group or a certain affiliation to a religious group, which endangers your life if you stay there. So the evaluators or the officials who are evaluating cases, so they look into these details, that
Absolutely.
why the move happened, and what you believe actually exists on ground or not. So that is the defining structure, and every character, be a refugee or asylum or IDP, they are governed by different set of laws.
I see.
So the refugees with the Refugee Convention, and the IDPs with domestic legislation and with UDHR, and asylums are again domestic laws, because every country has their own policies of who they will be able, because then there are situations which, as lawyers like ourselves, we should look into it, that if the state is not giving asylum or protection to the refugees, so we also need to establish that whether the state is unable or unwilling, because there are only these two conditions that you have to see. If the state is unable, that means that situations like refugees is considered universally as a shared responsibility.
I see.
So the other states should come and support that state,
I
because
see.
the state is unable to take care of those people,
No,
because
of
the
course.
state may be not economically that prosper to look after additional people.
Absolutely.
So you see, but if the state is unwilling
That's a different
to
story.
provide,
Yeah.
so in recent examples we have seen few countries, they didn't allow the Syrian refugees to enter. Canada had to step in and open the borders. So yes, there are examples where the states are unwilling to take care of the refugees on their land, and the same countries would be willing to support those host countries who are hosting thousands and hundreds and thousands of refugees.
No, it's really interesting how you mentioned that even refugees who are governed by an international regime, there is a strong link between the domestic law that then interprets who gets refugee status, how that's determined, all of that. So that's very interesting to see. My next question, I really wanted to look at how modern warfare has become this efficient process of taking out the enemy, but of course the primary victims of warfare are civilians and are people who eventually become refugees. What measures do you feel can be taken to reduce the impact of armed conflict on IDPs and refugees?
Okay. Before that, we need to look at the numbers, like how many people we are talking about, because the numbers would give,
that would be great, yeah.
give some reason to the argument. So there are around 32.5 million refugees around the world.
Wow.
As of 2022, as per the UNHCR data, which they yearly share. There are some 53.1 million IDPs, and there are 4.6 million asylum seekers.
Wow.
So we are talking about big numbers, and 76% of this number is contributed by 6 countries around the world.
So there are only 6 countries from which 76%
of this
refugees
number comes from these 6 countries.
My God.
Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar. These are the countries which you can say that there were conditions which forced the people to leave their homes. Wow. So of course, when these names come, so we know that there are conflict going on. So they all are conflict countries where a low threshold or a high threshold conflict is going on or was going on. So this is a clear indication that 76% is a big chunk of this number coming from only 6 countries.
And I think in Venezuela's case, it's the collapse of the economy and a lot
Yes.
of the
So,
issues that are happening over there. But
majority,
the vast
yeah,
majority,
yeah,
I
the
think 5
others
of the other ones are based
are
on
conflict.
violence and conflict
Yes.
and issues there.
And there are 5 countries who are predominantly shouldering the burden or the situation of the refugees, such as Turkey, Colombia, Uganda, Pakistan, and Germany.
Wow.
So these are the countries which are hosting a lot of refugees. If we look more into our neighboring issue, Afghanistan, so Pakistan and Iran are hosting the majority of the refugees.
Of course.
So that's the number that I wanted to.
But it's very, very interesting to see here that, some of the conflicts that are taking place, whether it's a Syria thing, you have Turkey, fine, that's a bordering country, but none of the others are mentioned in this list, right? Yeah. There are a number of, conspicuous countries that are absent from, shouldering this common responsibility that the world has to citizens of the world who are suffering or who are feeling persecution. But we don't see that being equally shared or shouldered by all of these countries. It's very interesting to note that.
Yeah, and on that, if you look at the contribution, so 46% of the total funding of the UNHCR comes from the United States.
Wow.
And United States is only 7% using those funds as part of like for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So they're the biggest contributors, but at the same time they're the least users of that fund, which is globally contributed. So of course, there are countries, and as I said,
and also the interesting debates as well that the US might be causing a lot of the refugees.
This is.
But again, this is a contentious issue, so we want that. But again, going back to the question, and I'm really grateful that you told these numbers because I didn't have the scale in mind, to be honest. But we're talking about these numbers of this scale. How do we reduce the impact of armed conflict on?
So if the application of law in the ideal world, so I'm speaking of the ideal world, that if the states and those who are instigating wars or conflicts, or those who are receiving the wrath of the conflicts, if those states follow the law and abide by the certain principles, like for example international humanitarian law, if they follow the certain principles of international humanitarian law, like military necessity, like proportionality, like principles of humanity, if they're mindful of these principles, and over 150 years ago when these laws were in process of drafting, so the authors of those laws really did a great job in identifying the key reasons that if you follow those standards, so for example, military necessity, which means a very targeted approach, humanity, proportionality. So if the civilians are led to believe in conflict situation that they won't be made an object of attack, and their women and children would be safe because that they are not directly taking part in hostilities, so they are Okhti Kamba, so they're not taking direct part in hostilities, so they know their status. What they don't know is that whether they will be made an object of attack or not. So under that confusion, so this is a basic human instinct. If you see fear, if you see a building next to your building where civilians are targeted, where hospitals are targeted, where mosques are targeted, so all those civilian objects which are made an object of attack and disregard the international humanitarian law in times of armed conflict, or even because if there is if these buildings are attacked, so of course it's not a peaceful time. Exactly. Whether it's internal disturbance, again the threshold is so high that we can easily qualify it as a non-international armed conflict.
Absolutely.
So not going into the debate of whether it's international or non-international, but if the civilian objects are made target, so the civilians, that's their fundamental right to leave the place and seek protection.
I see.
So first of all, they would become internally displaced.
Yeah.
And then moving from internally displaced, they will graduate to another status, which would be refugee when they cross the international borders.
Yeah.
So, to cut the long story short, adherence to law, respect of law, if it is maintained and if the laws are respected, and certain principles, that civilians should not be made object of attack.
Yep.
And this is very much provided in almost all the religious texts, in all the laws. So you would see that people who do not fight with you do not fight with them. Surah Baqarah lays a very fundamental principle, mat lado unse jo nahi ladte tumse, don't fight those who do not fight with you.
Absolutely.
So the distinction is very, very clear, that you do not fight with those who do not fight with you. So in war, it does not say that you don't fight with those who fight with you, you fight with them. So the law does not prohibit fighting. What the law prohibits is that those who are not fighting with you, you don't fight with them. And that's the distinction, that's the clarity if it is understood. Issues such as refugees, issues such as IDPs, I'm not saying that the numbers would come to zero, but we can certainly reduce this number. Because of this massive exodus, people coming out of the conflict zones out of fear.
So, this discussion really leads me to think of one thing, that, perhaps IDPs are even more at risk because, you can impose international law obligations on a state pretty straightforwardly, right? A state ratifies a convention or customary international law applies to it, the rules apply to it. So IHL, for example, vast majority is customary international law. But when it comes to non-state actors, especially when they're operating within a state in a non-international armed conflict, it's very difficult to expect them or try to ensure that they comply with the military's necessity and all the rules of IHL. So would you think that IDPs are at more risk than, say, refugees? They have fewer protections, and do you think we should continue to be treating both these two categories as distinct categories, or should we have an understanding, a legal understanding of this on more common ground, the fact that they're both displaced people, right? Something along those lines.
I would agree to some extent that yes, IDPs are more vulnerable because they are more exposed, or they are in the theater of the war.
Yes.
So the proximity is the key line.
Yeah.
So the more closer you are, the bigger the challenge. So if we take this question very straightforward, that yes, of course, the closer to the fire, the chances of getting burned are higher than those who saw the fire and ran away. So they made their escape. But when it comes to the challenges, I have seen situations myself in my professional career. I have met refugees, I have met IDPs. The situation is very much similar. The trauma that they go through, the challenges that they face in terms of women, children, and even adults, the psychological trauma, because the moment you leave your home, the trauma begins.
Oh, absolutely.
And then the mere fact that you don't know that where I will land, what will happen with me, the road that I have taken. So these are the challenges, which are the unseen challenges. Like, the law can define certain challenges, but the law cannot define the human experience that you go through. So as I said, that the moment you leave home, you just go into different stages where the international legal regime applies and then changes. So you leave your home, you are within the country, because you're not just come out of your home and you are in a new country. So of course you have to cover a certain journey to reach to the border and the safe borders. And then
which might be right across the country.
Right across. But you will choose the safest and the nearest.
Yeah.
So that you can go and seek protection of that country. The neighboring country may not be very friendly country. That becomes another challenge, which takes you to a third country settlement.
Where you travel through.
You travel through the country, you become a refugee, but the moment you become a refugee, you seek for asylum into a third country resettlement. That, well, I'm not safe even here. I made it this far, but I need further protection. So then there are mechanism of third country resettlements.
And I think this is also a case where the second country, the country that you've just entered, doesn't have a mechanism to give you asylum or doesn't want to give you asylum at all, and so you seek third country.
There could be multiple reasons.
Okay.
There could be political reasons. That country may not be politically aligned with your ideology.
Of course.
Maybe the other country is friends with the forces of the other country, so they would see all the fleeing people as against them. So there could be political reasons behind it more than legal. There could be economic reasons. A country, if they cannot afford additional population to be added to their list, so they would make international appeals.
Absolutely.
For international funding. And then this is how the international funding comes in. So this everything works under, once you cross the border, everything works under the international framework.
Absolutely.
And under the international law. So if you are asking for funding to provide protection, because you term it as a collective effort of the states, and it's a shared responsibility for the persons of concern. So this is how you handle. So it's not one window operation. Absolutely. You really have to look into different aspects, again with one fundamental objective: protection.
Absolutely. Another question was, moving from the discussion we just had on the international regime, a key component is the International Refugee Convention, of course. But in South Asia, it's not ratified, I think, in any of the major countries in the region. And we have a very serious refugee issue. We have Afghans in Pakistan, we have the Rohingya from Myanmar in places like Bangladesh, India, even in Pakistan as well, right? Do you think that plays a major role in how refugees are dealt with in South Asia? And can we, enhance the protections of refugees in this region?
Okay. Again, there are two ways of looking at it. If we just wear the hat of lawyers and we only speak about the law, so of course, if you have not ratified an international instrument, you're not party to it, so you're not obliged to provide those protections. But then if you become a good lawyer and then you look into the details and you say, well, what is the essence of the law? Why this law is there and what this law says? So then you will find some common areas within other laws, such as the principle of non-refoulement.
Absolutely.
The principle of non-refoulement clearly states, which is part of the international customary law, that you cannot force anybody back to the country from where he or she fled, because that he or she was facing or feeling a fear of being persecution. So you cannot force them back. So this is the fundamental principle,
the
that
core of
the
the
core
protection.
of the international protection is that you cannot force them back.
Non-refoulement.
Right.
And just for viewers, customary international law applies to all states, regardless of whether they've signed a treaty or not.
Yes.
That is.
And the another angle of looking at customary law is that customary law is there in the domestic legislation in one way or the other, just like UDHR.
Okay.
So why UDHR is ratified or widely accepted by the entire world? Because the ingredients of UDHR are present in your domestic legislation.
Absolutely.
So there is no clash.
Absolutely.
So when there is no clash, then your domestic legislation and the international regime works very well.
Very true.
Because it is enshrined, and from where the national legislations take birth, your practices, your customary acts, your culture, your religion. So these 3-4 ingredients make your domestic legislation.
And especially in Pakistan, our constitution, for example, the human rights things, they're almost, they're very similar language to the ICCPR, the UDHR.
Exactly.
Some of the judgments that we're seeing is that, if there isn't a lot of clarity in your domestic system, you take the international conventions to read in the rights or the content of those rights here. So just supporting your argument. Absolutely.
So it's the case with most of the constitutions, because the constitutions or the domestic legislations, they take birth from the state practices, because as long as if you have in the true spirit translated the custom, culture, religion, economic status, geography into your constitution, so the laws would be followed by the people for who you make the constitution. Now, what difference it makes? Legally, it does make a difference if you are a party or if you're not a party. But let's look into practice. Pakistan is not signatory or ratified the Refugee Convention or the additional protocol, but we are hosting almost 2.1 million refugees on record.
Wow.
For example, when I say on record, it's around 1.4 million if the numbers have changed in recent months, but roughly 1.4 million those who have the proof of registration, the POR cards.
Okay.
And then there are 0.8 million who have the ACCs, the Afghan citizenship cards. So it
see,
means
yes.
that these cards were assisted by IOM and the government of Pakistan and the government of Pakistan and Afghanistan, who classified these people living in Pakistan, but they are Afghans. Right. So if we look at the number of Afghans, we have 2.1. If we strictly divide again, so 1.4 documented Afghan refugees in Pakistan. Pakistan has no domestic legislation for the refugees. But if you look at the court judgments in 2018 or in some of the cases like Saeed Abidi versus Nadra in 2018 or the Zarab Limited company, it was a company versus government of Pakistan, the courts have basically realized or in their judgments gave reference to the international conventions that, well, these conventions apply to the situations. And the judgments are a very clear indication that even if we have not ratified, the translation of the conventions in the judgments of through the domestic law, you can see that.
So they're being given effect,
Yes.
even if we haven't ratified
Exactly.
them.
So they have
That's
been
very
given
heartening.
effect. So that's the situation. So it's not easy to as I said, from the political perspective, this question would change. That why Pakistan has not signed. As a lawyer, if you look at it, then the definition changes. But as we are having a legal discussion, I would restrict myself to the legal debate.
No, absolutely, and very well answered, very helpful there. There's also the Global Compact on refugees, and do you think that is also? I mean, it's soft law; it's not binding as such on states. Do you think steps like this are also beneficial in the protection of refugees? Internationally, this movement that is occurring.
Very, very important, and it's a step in the right direction. Whether as a soft law or as a diplomatic effort. Refugees is a subject, again, it's a very personal perspective, that there are certain issues around the world which, like environment. So you really have to work consistently on these issues. You cannot say that XYZ year was a good year to talk about refugees. You talk about the refugees because there are still refugees as we are talking. Maybe somewhere in the world there are people crossing borders and becoming refugees. So it's not something which has finished, ended.
And there's certainly going to be refugees in the future.
Of course, there will be refugees in the
future. As
future.
long as there's warfare.
So any discussion, any step, or any commitments from the international community or the responsible states around the world, they should be welcomed because it is an issue which may grow, and I would hope that the issue ends and refugees become. But unfortunately, we have seen in the past and the way the humans react to the conflicts. So we will have refugees in future as well. So what is Global Compact? So it talks about 4 key objectives. One is ease the pressure on the host countries.
Okay.
So if we look at objective 1, back in early 2000, the United Nations came up with a program called RAHA, Refugees Affected Hosting Areas.
Okay.
So this program was primarily designed because when the refugee situation prolongs, so the hosting communities develop a certain degree of fatigue in hosting them because they think that the refugees within our communities are eating our resources.
I see.
So, for example, and these are actual examples. So, community A thinks that because of the refugees, our hospital was good for 300 people. Now, because of them, the number have increased to 900. So, it has more than doubled. The resources were available for us as a community.
And now they're being divided.
And now they're being used by a community which is not the community that belong to this area. So they then convert the definition of those people as a burden on resources.
I see.
Same goes for schools.
Absolutely.
Now, you see, it's a very tricky situation. So the host community is hosting a population which is not from the region, and the state is providing the necessary tools for them to survive. So access to health, access to education, access to basic resources like water, right?
Absolutely.
But then the host communities look at those resources and see the refugees as a burden. So that was a concept early 2000s that that the amount of funds, because it's all about spending.
Absolutely.
So that the spending of the UNHCR may also consider those communities where there are refugees living, so that they can work with the host communities. So spend a certain amount on the host communities, so that the host communities do not find refugees as a burden, but they see the refugees that because of them, a certain benefit is coming back to the community.
Absolutely.
So that was the philosophy.
I see.
And one of the famous lines that you would see in some leading refugee organizations, that Einstein was also a refugee.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this means that refugees, not necessarily that they will always come as a burden. There might be some very skilled, talented people that can benefit the country where they are residing.
Absolutely.
So that is also one. So number one is the pressure on the host country. So that was the background, that to help the countries to release that pressure.
Absolutely.
And the pressure is coming from the communities. Enhance refugee reliance. The third is expand access to third country solutions, so that the numbers are distributed, so that the pressure is released from the hosting country. Support condition in countries of origin for return. So this means the pull factors back in the country. So unless and until there are reasons to believe that the refugees can only return if they do not fall under the category of non-refoulement, and the return is voluntary.
I see.
So it is the voluntary repatriation which is a preferred solution. But for that voluntary repatriation, you need to establish a mechanism, an environment in that country which guarantees that they will be safe upon return.
This was going to be exactly my next question, in fact, is that, conflicts, it's very difficult to see when a conflict starts, when a conflict ends, right? And especially post-conflict situations, they're nowhere near how they were before the conflict, right? You have devastation there. You don't have the necessary government infrastructure there to be able to support communities. So how do you make determinations of when it's safe to go back? When refugees can return to an area?
Well, again, legally, if the conflict has ended,
okay, the hostilities have ended.
If the hostilities have ended, so that is the time when you can safely say that now there is no more conflict.
I see.
And you relate that notion to the principles that the place is now safe. So you directly target the principle of protection, that there is no more fear of persecution.
I see.
So that if there is a regime in place, and if that regime is looking after the people, so of course there won't be any. So legally you would see that the hostilities have ended, because the occupying powers or the two warring factors, they come through a declaration, or there is a peace agreement. So there will be some piece of evidence which will support that the hostilities have ended.
And that fear of persecution has diminished?
Well, that is a tricky one
Okay,
because we cannot determine that, because the fear of persecution so we start from the communities. So if there is a certain community which as a community feel a fear that we are a certain community, we will be targeted if we go back.
Say like a particular religious minority
Religious minority,
or some
right?
ethnic
or,
group or something like that.
or a political group.
Okay.
A political group that was active and that was fighting alongside the others. So the powerful actors have left, but then the less powerful are at the mercy of the others. So there could be political reasons.
And how do you say in society that now this society has developed, evolved, it's become enlightened, it won't persecute these people anymore, right?
You can't say that.
It's very difficult.
You can't say that.
Yeah.
So it again comes case by case. So if they came as mass exodus, the return would be one by one, family by family. So that's why if you look at the UNHCR voluntary repatriation programs, so they send families. And there was also a program which UNHCR initiated for Pakistan because some people would go and they would come back. So it was not a good value for money by paying them, and they would go, take the money and come back. So it was a burden on the international funding, because ultimately they would come back as refugees.
Absolutely.
So then they started a program which was called Go and See, Come and Tell.
Okay.
So one of the family member would go and they would see that, can we return? Is it so the cost was less, but when they would come back, so they would believe, because the famous M's of communication, that what is your message, who is your messenger, what is your medium. So if we look at those three M's, because the communities would like to go back, but they would like to hear it from somebody they trust.
Absolutely.
Somebody they know that,
Very
okay, the
interesting.
message is that you're safe, come back. They say like, who is saying this? So that defines. So it's a very, very, it's not that one size fits all.
I see.
So
I
there
see,
would
of
be
course.
people who would rush back to their countries
I see.
immediately. Like the last bullet, they won't wait for the treaty and they would go back
Voluntarily
voluntarily.
heading back. Okay.
Because then they will have some very important stakes in the country, because the earlier you return, the better are the chances for the livelihood, because you secure the fort, you go back and you volunteer your services there. So you might join the government, you might join politics, because a country after war is in position to reposition their government machinery.
Absolutely.
So many refugees that you see around the world. Karzai was a refugee in Pakistan, then he was a president in Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
So it's not that he just returned to his country. He returned to his country as one of very powerful presidents.
And often, in situations of armed conflict, you will have political leadership that is in exile.
That's in exile.
And
they
that is
return.
yeah, absolutely.
It's not one fits all.
No, absolutely,
situation.
absolutely. These were, exceptionally interesting questions, I think, that we went into. I'm extremely grateful to you, Dilawar Saab, for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, that's our podcast on armed conflict and refugees. I think we discussed a lot of different issues in a very short span of time. So Dilawar Saab, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
Goodbye. Thank you.